You pick up a knife to cut an apple. You don't think about it. Metal, shaped into an edge, doing exactly what you need. It feels ordinary. But the real answer to where that edge came from is far stranger than you think. Before there was steel, before there was bronze, there was a rock that fell from the sky. Around 3200 BCE, in a small settlement called Gerza in Egypt, people were wearing beads made of iron. Not iron pulled from the ground, iron pulled from a meteorite. Researchers who later examined those beads found nickel ratios that could only come from space, hammered cold into shape by hands that had no furnace, no forge, no idea what a metal even was as a category of thing. To them, this wasn't ore. It was starlight, fallen and solid. Why would anyone bother? Rock is everywhere. Wood is everywhere. But this rock bent instead of breaking. This rock could be reshaped again and again without ever running out of new form. That single discovery, that some stone remembers nothing and gives you anything, is the seed of every blacksmith who would ever exist. For thousands of years after that, humans mostly worked with what fire alone could soften. Copper came first because copper melts at a temperature a simple pit fire can reach. You dig it, you heat it, you pour it. Simple. Then someone, no name survives, no site marks the moment, noticed that copper mixed with a little tin became harder, sharper, and held an edge far longer. That mixture is bronze. It changed warfare, farming, and trade routes across 3 continents, and it happened by trial, not theory. Nobody understood alloys. They understood results. But bronze had a weakness. Copper is common. Tin is not. To make bronze at scale, entire empires built supply chains stretching thousands of kilometers just to keep tin flowing. From mines in what is now Afghanistan, from Cornwall in Britain, funneled toward workshops in Egypt and Anatolia and the Aegean. That kind of dependency is fragile. And when those supply chains snapped, through war, through migration, through the wave of collapse historians now call the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, something had to fill the gap left behind. Iron filled it. Iron ore is common almost everywhere, sitting in reddish streaks in ordinary hillsides across nearly every continent. The problem was never finding it. The problem was heat. Bronze melts around 950 degrees Celsius, a temperature a simple open fire, fed with enough charcoal, can reach. Iron needs temperatures well over 1,500 degrees just to melt outright, and the early furnaces of the ancient world, simple clay-lined pits called bloomeries, couldn't get there. So the iron never fully melted at all. What came out of a bloomery instead was a spongy, half-solid lump called a bloom, riddled with ash, charcoal fragments, and unburned rock called slag. Someone had to beat that lump, again and again, folding it over on itself, hammering it while it glowed, forcing the slag out drop by drop before it became anything close to a usable blade. Early Hittite texts, some of the oldest writing to mention iron at all, describe it as a royal material, tightly controlled, sometimes reserved for gifts between kings rather than ordinary trade. Whoever mastered that process first held something closer to a monopoly on the future. Think about what that means for the person doing it. This is not casting. This is not pouring metal into a mold and waiting. This is a person standing over glowing iron with a hammer, reading the color of the metal to know its temperature, reading the sound of the strike to know if it's ready, feeling for something that cannot be written down or taught in a single sentence. It has to be learned in the body, one burn and one failure at a time. Becoming good at it wasn't optional training. It was survival by repetition. Burns were routine. Blindness from staring too long into white-hot metal was a known occupational risk. Lungs filled with smoke and fine metal particulate over a lifetime spent bent over a forge. Nobody chose this path lightly, and the ones who mastered it were, by definition, the ones who had survived years that broke or maimed many who tried before them. That's why the first blacksmiths weren't seen as workers. They were seen as something closer to sorcerers. In Greek myth, the smith god Hephaestus is the only god who works. He builds thrones, weapons, even living mechanical servants down in a forge beneath a volcano. In Norse legend, Wayland the Smith is a captive genius, hamstrung by a king who wants to keep his skill imprisoned, who still builds wings from metal and escapes anyway. In the Hebrew Bible, Tubal-cain is named as the very first to work bronze and iron, placed in the same early lineage as the first musician and the first herder. Smithing treated as a founding human skill, not a side trade. Across parts of West Africa, oral traditions describe smith lineages that were feared as much as respected, sometimes kept apart from the rest of the community through marriage restrictions, sometimes credited with the power to heal or to curse because they were the ones who could take a dead, dark rock and force living fire out of it. In some of these traditions, the smith is also the woodcarver, the circumciser, the keeper of certain rituals. One figure holding several roles that all share the same theme: transformation of raw material into something with power over life. Even in ancient China, iron and its makers carried a similar weight. Some of the earliest known cast iron objects appear in graves from the Zhou period, treated as valuable enough to bury with the dead, a sign that the metal itself, and by extension, the person who could shape it, carried status well beyond simple utility. Why does the pattern repeat, culture after culture, with no contact between them? Because what a smith does looks, from the outside, like transformation with no visible cause. You bring them a dull, shapeless rock. You come back later and there's a blade, a plow, a nail, a needle, something that can save your family's harvest or take someone's life, made from something that used to just sit in the dirt. For most of human history, that gap between shapeless rock and sharp, useful object had no rational bridge in most people's minds, so they filled it the only way people always fill an unexplained gap: with myth. The smell alone would have marked the smith as different. Smoke, scorched metal, the sound of the hammer audible before you could even see the forge, day and night, from a structure most people were told to keep their distance from. Anthropologists studying craft specialization have long noted a pattern. The more physically dangerous and skill-intensive a trade is, the more likely it is to accumulate ritual, taboo, and secrecy around it. Fire itself was already treated as something semi-sacred in most early societies, a force borrowed rather than owned. Combine that with a trade that seemed to command fire on demand, bending stone with it, and you get a role that almost had to be wrapped in myth just to make it psychologically bearable to live next to. Smithing sits near the top of that list in almost every early society where it appears. There's something else worth noticing. The smith didn't just make objects. The smith made the tools that made every other trade possible: the farmer's plow, the carpenter's axe, the soldier's sword, even the tools other smiths would use to become smiths. Whoever held that skill effectively held a kind of leverage no other worker had, and history shows it. In some societies, smiths grew wealthy and powerful. In others, that same power made them outsiders, too useful to expel, too dangerous to fully welcome in. Now think about what's changed and what hasn't. You don't call the person who makes your knives a sorcerer. You call them a manufacturer, or more likely, you don't think about them at all. The transformation that once required years of apprenticeship, burns, scars, and half-understood instinct now happens in a factory you'll never see, run by people whose names you'll never learn, using processes you don't need to understand to benefit from them. That mystery didn't disappear. It just moved. It moved into the phone in your pocket. Built from rare metals and silicon processes almost nobody who owns one could actually explain from first principles. It moved into the car you drive, the medicine you swallow, the plane you trust to hold together at 30,000 feet. You trust that it works. You don't ask how, and most days you don't need to. That is almost exactly the relationship an ancient villager had with the person hammering iron in the dark at the edge of the settlement. Useful, a little unsettling, and quietly essential. Notice, too, that the old language hasn't fully disappeared. It just got repurposed. Companies still reach for words like artisan, master craftsman, forged by hand, precisely because that old reverence still sells, even now, even completely divorced from an actual forge. You don't believe a hand-stamped leather wallet was made by magic, but something in you still responds to the word handmade a little differently than manufactured, and that small, automatic response is a living fossil of exactly the awe this whole story has been describing. You picked up that knife without thinking. Somewhere behind it stands an unbroken chain of people who once thought they were handling something closer to magic than metal. And in the ways that matter, they weren't entirely wrong.